Hello friends, very blissful greetings of this lovely day to all of you. So, I Kunal Nagpal would like to welcome you to this great economic forum wherein today we are basically going to analyze the core aspects of the international economics, the scenarios existing across various geographies across the globe. We are quite aware that the present times are quite turbulent existing in today's times, wherein various countries' economies have got affected to a great extent. Whereas on the other hand, certain economies are able to take this crisis very positively, and hence they are trying to combat these times with great zeal, with great positivity, and that's why these economies like India are getting highlighted on the international forum. As we had discussed last night, India is being highlighted as the brightest spot in the entire global economic scenario, as being appreciated at the World Economic Forum by its chairman. So, today's economic scenario existing across the globe is being stated as the fragmented world economy. And so, the World Economic Forum annual gathering, which was held this year in Davos, Switzerland, ended with a call for more collaborative world. The World Economic Forum annual meeting 2023 ended on Friday, that is 20th January 2023, after 5 days of intense discussions on climate, war, and economic issues, with a call by the global leaders for a far more collaborative world. It also saw India emerging as a key pillar in the world order, with World Economic Forum founder and executive chairman Klaus Schwab describing the country as a bright spot in a fragile world. The 5-day meeting was actually attended by nearly 100 Indian leaders, including the 4 union ministers and 1 chief minister. So in his closing remarks, WEF President Mr. Borge Brent said it has been a remarkable week with significant progress made on climate action and equitable growth targets. The meeting, which actually began on Monday, witnessed special addresses by several heads of state or government and panel discussions by a large number of leaders from politics, business, academia, and civil society. The theme of the meeting was cooperation in a fragmented world, which is actually the need of the hour, and every nation should emphasize on this particular concept. Mr. Brent said the world may be fragmented today, but hopes have emerged here that it may not be so tomorrow. And that's why, as we have been propagating throughout our sessions, that we need to emphasize on global construction and not global destruction. So, dear guys, as of now, the fragmentation which is going on worldwide across major economies, that has actually caused nearly 7% of the global GDP. This is really quite a high figure which needs to be worked upon. So, asking the world to be pragmatic and collaborate, International Monetary Fund Chief Ms. Kristalina Georgieva, on Friday, that is on 20th January, said fragmentation can cost up to 7% of the global GDP. And as of now, the global GDP is 1.7%, my dear friends. And this is very, very low figure if we consider the overall statistics from past number of years for the entire world. So, if we don't unite now, we will face significant risk to the economy and people's well-being holistically, she said during a session on global economy on the last day of the World Economic Forum. The International Monetary Fund Managing Director said, if we look at the medium-term growth prospects, how we handle the supply chain issues, that will actually decide our future prospects. So, after going through this great overview of the entire world economy, with a core emphasis on what is actually the need of the hour, we are now going to study the overall economics of various nations, which are actually very, very crucial for maintaining global stability worldwide. And these economies are basically China, USA, India, and Japan. These are the major economies whose overall balance and effective functioning can actually affect the global GDP at a very massive rate. So, my dear friends, on this note, I would like to bring to your notice that Japan reports inflation hit 4%, which is actually 41-year high in December 2022. I repeat, it is 41-year high. So this is very alarming. Japan's consumer inflation rate hit a 41-year high of 4% in December 2022 as the prices for everything from burgers to gas surged. That rate is still relatively low compared to some other nations, including the US. Japan, the world's third largest economy, has been fending off deflation or chronically falling prices for decades. The last time core consumer prices rose that much was actually in December 1981. The Ministry of Internal Affairs and Communications said. The Federal Reserve and many other central banks have actually raised the interest rates to tame inflation, but the Bank of Japan has kept its benchmark rate at a long-standing low level of minus 0.1%. A sharp weakening of the Japanese yen against the US dollar and other currencies has actually added to pressures on the Bank of Japan, and speculation has been building that it might soon shift the course and start raising the interest rates altogether. Japan's core consumer price index, excluding the fresh food, rose 2.3% in 2022 from the year before, the highest in 31 years, the ministry said. The Bank of Japan's target inflation rate is actually about 2%. While the prices have risen more than usual, and some companies such as Fast Retailing, which operates the Uniqlo clothing chain, have announced wage increases, incomes in Japan have generally stagnated. So we have understood in this particular write-up that the Japanese economy is also going through a very tough time. Obviously, the cause is the global headwinds, which has caused 41-year high inflation, that is nearly 4%, which has hit the Japanese economy in December 2022. And this is really a very, very worrisome situation which needs the action. An optimum balanced approach is required to deal with this particular situation. Now, we are going to consider the relationships and the overall scenario existing between Indian economy and Sri Lanka, and how is China's relationships? How are the communication talks between China and Sri Lanka impacting the overall relationship scenario between India and Sri Lanka? Actually, as all of us are quite aware, that Sri Lanka has been hit by the great economic crisis ever last year. So India had provided the help, India had provided the assistance of nearly 4 billion US dollars, which had helped the Sri Lankan economy to actually deal with its great policy paralysis at a very considerable rate. Recently, China had also approached Sri Lanka to provide some help in terms of debt restructuring. Now, the Indian External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar has been recently on a 2-day visit to Colombo in Sri Lanka to actually further provide great help to Sri Lanka. And I would like to bring to your knowledge that India, Japan, and China are actually the major creditors to Sri Lanka. So, emphasizing on Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji's neighborhood first policy, the External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar on Friday, that is 20th January 2023, assured Sri Lanka of full cooperation and financial help, and announced that India has extended financing assurances to the IMF, that is the International Monetary Fund, to clear the way for Sri Lanka to actually move forward. Taking a swipe at China, which is accused of ruining Sri Lanka's economy and not helping in the recovery plan, Jaishankar said this year, in a developing situation that was beginning to cause concern, the same sentiment reasserted itself. We felt strongly that Sri Lanka's creditors must take the proactive steps to facilitate its recovery. India decided not to wait on others, but to do what we believe is actually right. We extended financing assurances to the International Monetary Fund to clear the way for Sri Lanka to move forward. Our expectation is that this will not only strengthen Sri Lanka's position, but it will also ensure that all the bilateral creditors are dealt with equally. So, while Japan and India have agreed to the Lankan debt restructuring plan, China is yet to decide. India, China, and Japan are the 3 big creditors for Sri Lanka. Dr. S. Jaishankar delivered these remarks in Colombo following his meeting with President of Sri Lanka, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe, and the Foreign Minister, Mr. Ali Sabri. The minister was actually on a 2-day trip to Sri Lanka to announce India's support critical for an IMF bailout of $2.9 billion and additional Indian FDI for the overall speedy recovery of the Lankan economy. Sri Lanka's pathway is actually one of a strong economic recovery propelled by greater investments. Here too, I have a clear message that I will be sharing with the business community. India will encourage greater investments in the Sri Lankan economy, especially in the core areas like energy, tourism, and infrastructure, the minister said. So my dear friends, after having developed the broad comprehensive framework of the overall relationship India is having with Sri Lanka and how India is adopting the policy of helping the neighborhood first is actually being appreciated by the Lankan economy, and how India approached the International Monetary Fund to actually finance the assurances and clear the way for Sri Lanka to move forward, and convincing it to actually bail out $2.9 billion, along with providing additional Indian FDI for the speedy recovery of the Lankan economy, is actually very noble step. And obviously it very beautifully emphasizes the concept of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the way our leaders are living this particular theme and are propagating it worldwide through their unified approach towards their overall actions is actually commendable. So now we are going to understand the another major development which is happening across the globe, and that is China+1. All of us are quite aware of the China+1 strategy. All of us know that China has been undergoing through a massive turmoil since 2020. That is, by the end of 2019, the Chinese economy has been facing a lot of problems. As of now, its GDP is nearly 3%, and majorly many countries are trying to diversify away their manufacturing operations from China. Though some countries have been of the approach of China+1, that is along with having their operations, that is manufacturing operations, outsourced from China. They are looking for they are looking for the diversification of their overall manufacturing portfolio in other countries across the globe, considering India and Vietnam majorly. But now the global corporations are mulling over minus China. Now what does minus China mean? Minus China mean to altogether finish their operations from China and establish their establish their manufacturing operations, sourcing of manufacturing operations entirely in different countries. And obviously here India has huge opportunities, great opportunities. So the COVID crisis hastened the adoption of China+1. Now, as another COVID wave in the East Asian country makes the global corporations relive the pandemic nightmare, the experts are observing a trend of minus China. And this strategy is actually gaining ground among the actors in the global value chains. The world's leading manufacturers are highly dependent on China, known as the world's factory, for their sourcing and production operations. China+1, coined in 2013, was all about these companies developing similar bases outside China simultaneously so that they are less reliant on one country. The COVID shutdowns, US-China trade war, supply chain disruptions, and the latest geopolitical developments forced the corporations to adopt the +1 strategy. I repeat, the COVID shutdowns, US-China trade war, supply chain disruptions, and latest geopolitical developments forced the corporations to adopt the +1 strategy. The argument was that having other sourcing and manufacturing destinations would actually ensure their global operations do not get crippled if China faces a crisis. So, minus China, which is a new development, minus China, on the other hand, denotes manufacturers looking to move their operations out of China altogether. These corporations see this strategy as a prudent move in the face of the escalating crisis in China. Now, we are going to consider the aspect that why minus China is actually gaining ground across the globe. Actually, there are a host of reasons why minus China is finding more traction. Most Western economies are quite distrustful of China now. Beijing's recent threats to invade South Korea and its tacit support to Russia in the Ukraine conflict have actually widened this distrust. More recently, President Xi Jinping's handling of the latest COVID crisis, the lockdowns and the protests against the government's zero COVID policy have actually raised red flags in many quarters. But the worst isn't over yet. Though the COVID restrictions have been relaxed, as the government has allowed travel, the doctors, that is the epidemiologists, say the whole of China is at risk now, as the virus would spread to the non-urban areas too. The leading global epidemiologist and health economist, Mr. Eric Fragmented, had said the country faced a thermonuclear COVID outbreak. This is a nightmarish scenario for the global corporations that still remember factory shutdowns and long jams at the ports in China. Then there are problems related to labor issues, a ballooning real estate crisis, and the spiraling cost escalations. All these are actually diminishing the status of China as the world's go-to manufacturing destination, experts say. The global companies are not talking about minus China as openly as China+1 because now most of them fear that making such statements public will sour their relationships with Beijing and the repercussions wouldn't be pretty. So, the birth of this term has actually received little attention. But minus China is being talked about in hushed tones in the corporate corridors. Industry experts say that the corporations are seriously considering the possibility of quitting the manufacturing operations in China. They point to the reports of Apple moving iPhone production out of China in the wake of violent worker protests. The industry reports by the research firms indicate several multinational corporations have moved out of China in the recent years. Gartner's survey of 260 global supply chain leaders in February and March 2020 found that 33% had actually moved sourcing and manufacturing activities out of China or plan to do so in 2 to 3 years. These firms cited various reasons for their action, that is, intellectual property theft, human rights violations in Xinjiang, and the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy, among others. After the US-China trade war intensified, the toy maker Hasbro announced it was actually moving its business out of China. The industrial tools and household hardware maker Stanley Black & Decker permanently closed its factory in Shenzhen in November 2021 after 25 years of operation, reportedly because of rising labor costs. The companies like Dell had announced it would shift the part of notebook production out of China. Next, South Korea's Samsung Electronics shut its remaining smartphone factory in China in the year 2019. The big names in this bandwagon are not just IT and manufacturing firms, but even the investment firms. For instance, on November 14, 2022, BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager, announced that it had indefinitely postponed the launch of its exchange-traded fund in China. The Financial Times attributed it to the escalating US-China tensions. Now, among this overall scenario, what is the advantage for India? That is, what are the upcoming opportunities for the Indian economy? Let's explore. Several of these firms, including Apple and Samsung Electronics, have increased their presence in India lately. The Modi government's production-linked incentive schemes have helped attract many. So these PLI schemes are actually the key for boosting the overall investments by major MNCs across the globe in the Indian economy. So we have to take the full advantage and exploit this opportunity at the best possible level. The experts say with the companies like Samsung and Apple looking at India favorably, it would not be difficult to attract other companies as well. The industry observers say China+1 had itself encouraged the Indian government to make policies that attracted shifting companies. It had also raised the game of many MSME players, the backbone of the manufacturing and supply chain ecosystem. Mr. Vijay Kalandri, chairman of MVIRDC World Trade Center in Mumbai, a trade facilitation body, had estimated a value addition gain of $20 billion for India because of China+1 strategy. So, if India manages to attract 1% of the value chain of China's annual exports, both goods and services, of $2.01 trillion. So, if China+1 could do that, imagine what minus China can do. It can really create wonders. With China completely out of the equation, the global corporations would have to look at India for sure, say the experts. China+1 was about having the bases in China and also a place such as, say, Vietnam. In such a case, that is, in such a scenario, these companies could ignore India. But if China is totally out of the equation, then these companies cannot ignore India for sure. No other geography will give them a comparable domestic market, talent pool, educated workforce, emerging opportunities, and so on, they argue. And let's try to understand the key projections for the Indian economy in terms of the real GDP growth at constant market prices. For the financial year 2021-22, it's 8.7%. Then in 2022-23, it's 6.9%, and for 2023-24, it has been estimated to be 6.6%. Whereas the real GDP growth at the constant factor prices was 8.1% in the year 2021-22, 6.6% in the year 2022-23, and it has been projected to be 6.4% in the year 2023-24. The Global Business Advisory NextDigim had noted that China's business loss has been a gain for several South Asian countries, and India, Thailand, and Malaysia are actually emerging as the top manufacturing hubs in Asia. India specifically continues to enjoy the benefits of its large population, which helps in cost effectiveness across various parameters such as utilities, factories, manpower, etc. So vast population provides a very, very large domestic market, enabling manufacturing at scale to bring in required efficiencies considerably, it added. The United States of America's effort to create the supply chains that exclude China altogether is actually gradually leading to a restructuring, the overall restructuring of the global supply chains, says Mr. Ajay Srivastav, co-founder of Global Trade Research Initiative, a research and strategy consultant. The relocation of some large manufacturing firms shows that India is actually in a very good position to benefit from this emerging trend. Now, what are the certain steps to manufacturing supremacy? That is, how can India take the best possible advantage? What are the key strategies? What are the basic layout plans India should focus on in order to attract the companies and for overall supremacy of manufacturing? What are the key aspects India should stress on? And how should the overall remodification take place in order to boost the avenues in this particular scenario? Let's explore. India can actually position itself as an attractive destination for the foreign investors if it has the free trade agreements with major trade partners of China. The government should actually expedite the FTA negotiations with the European Union, which is the destination for 15% of China's merchandise exports. Already, India has signed the free trade agreements with United Arab Emirates and Australia that together account for 3% of China's merchandise exports. But in order to become the next China for the global manufacturers altogether, India actually needs to take a leaf out of Beijing's template, the experts say. Mr. Rltnshp, Deputy Head and Senior Economic Affairs Officer, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, that is South and Southwest Asia Office, says, the time is of the essence if India is to bring in reforms that can actually leverage on the happenings outside. The infrastructure bottlenecks at the border points, seamless connectivity and procedural burden to do the business are actually some areas that require urgent attention. He says, I repeat, that is, what are the key areas we need to work on? Infrastructure bottlenecks at the border points, seamless connectivity, and procedural burden to do the business are actually some areas that need urgent attention. So one of the first things to do is to have a conducive business environment for the firms to invest. The World Bank's latest ease of doing ranking shows India has more room for improvement. The country's economy, dominated by a large informal base, also needs to scale up manufacturing capacity in a very big way altogether. This is actually needed to cut the production costs. Economies of scale give China-based manufacturers an enormous cost advantage across the marketplaces. According to the United Nations Statistics Division, China accounted for 28.7% of global manufacturing output in the year 2019. India comprised a mere 3.1%. And recently, the Department of Investment and Public Asset Management, that is DIPAM Secretary Mr. Tuhin Kanta Pandey, had said the manufacturing comprised 16% of India's GDP, and there was actually a need to take it to about 25%. And for this to take place, we have to improve our overall manufacturing, he has said. And that's why our government is stressing on manufacturing. And we are really creating wonders in it gradually. Right? Now, our policy consistency has been elusive in this particular regard. Let's try to understand this. The first steps have to be more like giant leaps. Pouring money into some strategic segments is actually one way to start, says the former World Trade Organization Director General Mr. Pascal Lamy. First, invest heavily in infrastructure, that is energy, transports, mobility, and research. Second, open the Indian economy to the foreign competition in order to accelerate productivity gains in industry as well as in services and agri-food, says Mr. Lamy in an email interaction. The trade experts also emphasize that overtaking China in export and manufacturing will actually require employing a multi-pronged strategy, one that is economically holistic, not subjected to the arbitrary U-turns, remains consistent and is driven ground up. So what we require is actually the overall stability in our policy frameworks. Our political situation should also be stable. That's what the foreign companies demand. And that is actually the key requirement. So, according to Mr. Bhaskar Chakravarty, Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, an immediate issue for India is actually infrastructure. Access to logistics services, reliable transport systems, energy, and water sources are actually very essential for India to come anywhere close to China's claim of being the world's factory. If we are targeting to reach at the level of world's factory, these are the core factors, these are the core aspects on which we really need to work on with great energy, as being quoted by the leading pioneers of the industry. First is infrastructure. Second is the policy framework. Now, let's try to explore what does this mean. That is the overall stability in the policy framework of the nation. That is, it is the area where the Indian government needs to focus That is, focusing on creating a consistent and predictable set of policies and tariffs as they relate to the foreign firms. The international companies can never be sure when the policies will be reversed or changed and the tariffs imposed to favor the national champions. So they require some kind of security. They want we should formulate our overall policies and strategies in such a way that the foreign companies should actually feel secure. And for that, we need to incorporate the elements of consistency, stability, right? So that we can win their confidence and they also feel comfortable to actually establish their manufacturing operations in our economy. Many stakeholders flag up the widespread variations in laws and their interpretations in India by the 28 states and 8 union territories. In some cases, they say there's actually a tug of war between the states and the center. And that's actually the reality. There is actually a lack of synergy sometimes between the center and the states. So we should try to bring synergy. We should try to bring in more coordination. We should try to bring in the unified approach, the overall unity between the center and the states so that we act as one nation, one policy framework. And that's what the foreign companies demand. And it's well justified. Next, Mr. Bhaskar of Tufts University says, the businesses have to ultimately operate in a particular state. So while the central government plans the FDI policy, the realities of operating happen at the state level. India works under a principle of competitive federalism where the central government lets the states compete to make themselves attractive to businesses. And what does this lead to? This actually leads to a fragmented system altogether that can be confusing for the international companies. Mind you, the international companies are actually diversifying their manufacturing operations in a particular country just to have the stable operations. They are investing in a particular country. They are not investing in a particular state of a particular country. We should try to establish unity, a unified approach, a synergistic approach, a coordinated approach. However, if we work on the concept of competitive federalism where the central government lets the states to compete, making themselves attractive to the businesses, this leads to the fragmented system that can actually be very confusing for the international companies. And ultimately the result is that the different states have very, very different environments to facilitate the setting up and running of the businesses. So India has to promise seamless ease of doing business. China has been focusing on that for a few decades now. One factor that is favorable for India has been its democracy. Yes, democracy is a strong point. It's our core area of strength. But we should work on the aspect of ease of doing business so that the international companies feel secure, they feel comfortable operating in our country. Mr. Lamy says Indian governance is actually over bureaucratic, slow, cumbersome, and should actually be streamlined. Yet, seen from Europe, we wish India remains a vibrant democracy and not turn authoritarian, which actually entails an element of apparent and even real disorder. The diversity and differences are a richness which actually leads to more creativity and respect for the human dignity. This is again our strength. So for a society to thrive in the long run, power needs to be institutionally contestable and accountable. Media needs to be free and courts independent. This is not just an ideology. This is not just a concept, as the results point to the same conclusion as seen in the case of COVID or the invasion of Ukraine. I repeat, this is not just the ideology, as the results point to the same conclusion as seen in the case of COVID or the invasion of Ukraine. So, to be fair, the government has actually come up with a slew of attractive investment-friendly schemes to lure the foreign businesses. The prominent among them is the flagship production-linked incentive scheme, that is the PLI scheme. A recent analysis by the Credit Suisse revealed that the scheme is actually skewed towards assembly-based operations for attaining the peak revenue targets. It also said that while the segments like advanced batteries are actually better placed to benefit from the production-linked incentive, the global companies are very reluctant to enter other segments. This warrants policy tweaks. So, the basic need of the hour is that the small firms basically need big help. An almost unanimous view among the experts is that India should follow China's example of helping the small businesses scale up. Regulatory compliances are the basic key bottleneck for India's MSME sector, which is responsible for over 48% of the country's shipments. Easing business compliances and processes here will be the key in pushing the country up the trade ladder and on a par with China. Highlighting the compliance burden on MSMEs, Mr. Rishi Agarwal, CEO and co-founder, Team Lee's RegTech says an MSME basically deals with an average of 1,000 compliances annually, half of which carry clauses for imprisonment. The labor laws account for 30% of acts and rules, 47% of compliances, and 68% of the overall criminality in India's employer compliance. Most of our labor laws are actually created in the colonial era, when the country's socio-economic and political context was quite different. The law of the land is quite fluid and changes over 4,000 times a year. If Indian entrepreneurs need to become competitive globally, they need an enabling regulatory ecosystem that is rationalized and simplified to eliminate the redundancy and duplication. So my dear friends, these are the key aspects which we need to focus on in order to further enhance our overall capability and the capacity set to actually take the best use of the available opportunity, that is the upcoming minus China strategy, in order to make the full advantage of this particular opportunity, in order to make India an attractive destination for the foreign companies, for the international companies to actually think of establishing their manufacturing operations in India. We need to work on these aspects wholeheartedly. In addition, the deep-seated hostility and distrust in regulations, where every 2 out of 5 compliances can send an entrepreneur to jail, need an overhaul, says Mr. Agarwal. So, until all these issues are dealt with urgently, any hope of replacing China in the global value chains would actually be very far-fetched. So dear friends, after having developed such a broad, comprehensive viewpoint and very strategic perspectives being given by the leading pioneers across the globe, we should try to work on certain points in order to make our country, India, the best available option for the countries worldwide to actually consider India as the best option for their manufacturing operations. And obviously, if we possess such a strong set of core strengths like the implementation of the PLI schemes and the overall technical value set which we have, these are the core strengths. So we can obviously work on certain bottlenecks. We can obviously work on certain factors which are acting as the bottlenecks, and that is the synergy between the center and the state, and the overall stability of the regulatory framework, so that the MNCs, the international players, feel secure, feel comfortable if they establish their manufacturing operations here. Obviously, as our overall policy framework suggests, we are working on the concept of unified approach, that is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one global family. So obviously, if we understand the importance of the implementation of synergy between center and states, the importance of the stability which the MNCs are expecting from us in our overall policy framework, if we understand the importance of these aspects, then obviously obviously no one can stop us from being a winner. Obviously. So, on this note, I would like to conclude today's session, and I want all of you to think very deeply in this regard, and post your comments, post your suggestions, what all we need to work on. I have presented my suggestions along with the overall interpretation of the leaders' suggestions. Right now, you also think what all are the key aspects which we can actually capitalize, or what are the key aspects on which we can actually work. That is, try to do the SWOT analysis individually for our economy in order to take the best possible advantage of the upcoming opportunity of minus China strategy. Yes, my dear friends, it's on the way. This strategy is on the way. Now, China+1 is actually fading away and minus China strategy is coming. So, this is your homework. And obviously, we will meet next very soon. Until then, take excellent care of yourselves. Namaskar. Jai Hind.